The big question, it seems to me, is less the nature of the political regime and more two other issues that factor in. So in other words, not just sort of a question of is it a democracy or is it an autocracy? One of the issues is the competence of the leadership, the ability of the leadership to get things done, things done effectively and consistently. And in a sense, you could say both democracies and autocracies have shown themselves to be incompetent. The US, the UK, Brazil, Iran, Venezuela, these were all incompetent countries in terms of dealing with COVID, even though they had quite different forms of political governance. And of course, there have also been competent regimes spread across the range of political outcomes. You have Germany, you have Norway, but you also have China, of course. So competence is one issue, but equally important is whether or not the leadership in any given nation has been able to elicit compliance from its subjects. Now, obviously, autocracies have an advantage in that they're able to take firmer measures, but in a sense, so can democracies, as long as they have buy-in from citizens who see themselves as, part of the way in which these countries are ruled. And I think one of the interesting things about the first wave of the pandemic was that some democracies actually underestimated their population's willingness to have firm measures imposed. We see that with the Tories in the early months of 2020, when they thought that the British would simply not sit still for widespread lockdown, even though when they finally rolled it out, there really were very few complaints. And we see much the same thing in Sweden, where the government simply did not think that Swedes would accept a broad lockdown and therefore didn't impose it on them. But I think it's largely unlikely to think that the Swedes would somehow have risen up against a government-imposed lockdown while the Danes and the Norwegians accepted it. The Prime Minister of New Zealand talked a lot about her team of 5 million. There are very few countries who had the same sense as one did in New Zealand of a kind of common purpose. And in most other countries, things became highly politicized and controversies erupted. The lack of popular support for government policies quickly became evident in countries like the US and Brazil. But of course, there were huge anti-lockdown, anti-masking protests in almost all democracies. We just had a whole violent set of protests in the Netherlands. So if you want to sort of step back from this issue about democracies and how well they did, I think there are other issues than just the political system here. If you look at the Asian nations, only some of which were autocratic after all, they were willing to impose drastically on the few people who posed a danger. The democracies, in contrast, had to impose broad but only moderate lockdowns because they were unwilling to impose drastic solutions on the few people who were infected or the contacts of the infected. And you could almost say that the democracies paid a greater attention to the rights of the few, but that the democracies therefore ended up paying a price for that because they had to impose broad measures and huge costs and enormous loss of life and economic downturn on the majority. It's the democracies, as it were, paid an obvious price for not being willing to impose on their populations. If you look at contact tracing apps, there's a very specific example of this, that contact tracing apps in the West have effectively been rendered worthless because you cannot, politically speaking, make them anything other than voluntary, because otherwise you end up violating privacy considerations that are taken to be more important than the ability to actually trace people and find out who they've been in contact with and whether they pose a danger. So in other words, the point I'm trying to make here is that there's more than just democracy versus autocracy at work here. China did well because they didn't have to worry about the niceties of democratic decision making. And yes, of course, it's true that South Korea and Taiwan are democracies, but they have, these Asian nations, in common, a certain kind of cultural capital that they can draw on when they demand sacrifices of their citizens that isn't as easily available in the West. There's a kind of ethnic and cultural homogeneity a kind of common set of standards of socialization in these countries that is simply not the case in the West any longer in a way that can be used or mobilized in public health terms. So in other words, it's less the political system and it's more a question of cultural ethos, of accepting what the authorities propose. I think this cultural ethos of accommodation explains a lot of the Asian success. And oddly enough, it's what the Swedes too were relying on, a kind of disease prevention groupthink, if you will, the assumption that people knew and understood what was expected of them and would do it. In Asia, citizens agreed to obey what the authorities demanded without kicking up the kind of fuss that has plagued the Western democracies. Democracy is, it must be said, a feeble system when it comes to taking quick and decisive action that involves a lot of sacrifice by its citizens.